Minutes ago, we were joined from Kabul by the ranking Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator John McCain. Senator McCain, I know that you have been fearful that the president's plans to withdraw 33,000 troops by September of next year is risky both to the troops and to the advances that have been made on the ground. Have you seen or heard anything during your visit there that causes you to rethink that?
No, basically what I've seen and heard here, both from Afghans as well as a number of Americans, is that it is an unnecessary risk. It was not recommended by any of the military, and I hope that it will work out, but it is certainly deprives us of the necessary troops that we needed for the second fighting season.
Lieutenant General John Allen, as you know, is the nominee to be the U.S. commander in Afghanistan. He was testifying on Capitol Hill this week, and I wanted to play you part of what he said. And basically, his position is he supports the president's withdrawal plan. Here's a little bit of what he said.
This reality sends an important message of commitment to the Afghan people, as well as a sense of urgency that Afghans must take more responsibility for their security.
So you have said to follow the lead of the commanders on the ground. This is the soon-to-be commander on the ground. Shouldn't that make you feel a little better? He thinks this can work.
Well, Candy, I hope that it'll work. Most people would tell you that it's an unnecessary risk. I fully expect that General Allen and others to salute and go carry out their mission as best they can. But the fact is that there was no recommendation by any military person to have this early withdrawal, and it is an unnecessary risk. Our allies are already following suit by announcing withdrawals, but most important, we are told that in the villages that the Afghans are now wondering if we're leaving or not, and that can undermine the whole effort and sacrifice that's been made ever since this important surge began.
Chairman Mike Rogers of the Intelligence Committee on the House side was quite blunt with me last week, and he said he thought that the president did this particular troop withdrawal with the timing that it has for purely domestic political reasons. Do you agree with that?
No, I can't accuse the president of that, Candy. I do say that the president shouldn't have announced when he did in 2009 that we would be withdrawing troops in 2011. He didn't give them the full complement they needed. It was about 10,000 short, which then necessitated a second fighting season. But look, I question whether this was the right decision or not, but I can't question the president's patriotism.
Let me ask you about, there was an explosion at a hotel in Kabul this week. The McCAIN network has taken credit for it, if that's the word. They, of course, are associated with the Taliban. At the same time, we know the U.S. is reaching out with the Taliban for possible peace talks in the future. Do you see any signs that Taliban is ready to talk peace?
There's been no signs whatsoever. When the Taliban are ready to talk peace, it will be when they are convinced that they can't achieve their goals on the battlefield. Now, we have had enormous success over the past year, and I should have mentioned that earlier in our conversation, and we've taken out a lot of the mid-level Taliban that are operating in Afghanistan. One of our big problems is, of course, Pakistan, and a lot of the leadership resides in Pakistan. And we're going to have a realistic assessment of the true situation in Pakistan, because there's no doubt that there is connections between ISI and the Haqqani network, who were responsible not only for the hotel tragedy there, but also for the attacks on Americans and our allies, and that's not acceptable.
And to Libya now, we have seen in the Middle East and elsewhere that often when there is the removal of a leader, that chaos ensues. We certainly saw that in Iraq to a certain extent. We're still seeing it a little bit in Egypt. Do you think the U.S. and northern African countries have any kind of plan on what would happen and what they would do about likely chaos if Muammar Gaddafi should leave? The man has chemical weapons. He has ground-to-air missiles. All of those, as you know, could fall into the wrong hands. What's the U.S. plan here?
I think the U.S. plan there is to provide assistance and to do the things that, in fact, I would have recognized the Transition National Council a long time ago as a legitimate voice of the Libyan people. But it's also a larger impact on our European allies, and I would give a lot of the responsibility to them, the Italians, French, and others. But Candy, this notion that we should fear who comes after or what comes after Gaddafi ignores that if Gaddafi stays in power, it is then a direct threat to our national security. He has promised that. We kept the people from Benghazi from suffering a slaughter. And this guy has the blood of Americans on his hands. He's committed acts of terror, and he certainly is committed to committing more of those if he's able to remain in power. This thing could have been over a long time ago if we had acted decisively with the use of American air power. And tragically, thousands and hundreds, if not thousands, of young people have been wounded and killed because this conflict has lasted so long because we failed to use American air assets.
Let me bring you back home to the domestic problem that is hanging up Congress at this point, and that is increasing the debt ceiling and the comparable part to this puzzle, which is lowering the U.S. deficit, sorry. Would you, in the spirit of compromise, would you, Senator John McCain, not speaking for the Republican Party, could you see your way clear to voting for some sort of tax increase, whether it's closing a loophole of oil companies or charging those who have private jets? What would be so wrong with that?
Well, I think that if we did those small things you're talking about, they would have very small impact. But the principle of not raising taxes is something that we campaigned on last November. And the results of the election was that the American people didn't want their taxes raised, and they wanted us to cut spending.
But what about compromise?
I would argue that if we do otherwise, well, you know, the American people, as the president described it, administered or shellacking, they don't want compromise. They want us to balance the budget. They want us to stop mortgaging our children and our grandchildren's futures, and they don't think that they need their taxes raised, and I don't either. And I think that this catastrophe or short-term meltdown that we're facing isn't nearly as bad as the meltdown that we're facing unless we get our deficit under control.
No way, no how would Senator John McCain vote for anything, a closing of a loophole or a tax hike of any sort.
Candy, John Kyle was in negotiations, as you know, with the vice president, and he said there were certain revenue raisers in other areas that perhaps we could work on. But to somehow say that we are going to raise Americans' taxes, anybody's taxes, I think is something that, a principle that we promised the American people last November and that we have to stick to.
Could you share with us what sort of revenue raisers might be okay with you?
No.
You're no fun. Thank you very much, Senator John McCain. We appreciate your taking the time this morning.
Thanks for having me on, Candy.
Up next.